Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Harper Feist, and I'm happy to have accepted the invitation of the USOTO Grand Lodge Education Committee to present my thoughts about the evolution of the PGM rite, popularly known as the Headless Ritual, all the way 1700 years in the future to Liber Samekh, a ritual that we all know and love. I can't even get started without mentioning my influences in this area, and therefore I confess willingly that I will be speaking under the influence today of Jake Stratton Kent, Florence Farr, Hans-Dieter Betts, Aleister Crowley, many of my friends, some of you, and several other people. So by way of introduction, as soon as I got into this whole Thelemic adventure, I began to be fascinated with Liber Samekh. I've performed the ritual a whole bunch of times, even as many of you have, and obtained some really shocking and interesting results. So it's no mystery that the day came when I wanted to figure out where it came from. And this presentation, The History and Use of the Bornless Ritual, is sort of a documentation of my faltering steps toward the understanding of Liber Samekh. Obviously, this is a recorded talk, but I'll be available at the end if you have any questions. Okay, here we go. And here's an agenda for the next 45 minutes or so. First, we'll dive into the origins of Liber Samekh as they lay in the post-Alexandrian Empire. What I'm going to claim here is that none of this stuff would have happened without Alexander the Great. We'll see if you buy that at the end of the talk. Then we're going to focus on the Greek magical papyri, Book 5, lines 96 through 172, which is the ritual that we all in the occult world nowadays call the Headless Rite. But in order to discuss that, we have to actually talk about what is the Greek magical papyri. We also need to define what theurgy might have meant in the post-Alexandrian world. Further, we'll talk about the translation history. And I promise this is not as boring as it sounds, because it allows us to answer the question, where may Crowley have discovered this weird thing? Further, of course, people have been thinking about this since Crowley, and we'll talk a little bit about those researchers and the new context that they've kind of come up with. So, order of operations, the Headless Rite, preliminary invocation of the Goetia, which is the Bornless Ritual, and then we'll move to Liber Samekh. And we're going to celebrate Liber Samekh a whole bunch. Now, we can't really move away from this slide without discussing this very odd picture on the side. The PGM, the Greek magical papyri, is full of illustrations, and this is one of those. This guy is a headless person, and I should say that this picture is not associated with the Headless Ritual. It's a different one. But the PGM is full of pictures like this, and it emphasizes the use of vowels in these spells. The vowels could be musical notes. They could even be gods. Another interesting thing about this picture is little golf flags on top of this guy's neck. Some people think they're probably droplets of blood, but researchers, those curious onlookers, are in some degree of controversy about that. The context under which the Greek magical papyri was written is the immediate post-Alexandrian world. And what I'm talking about here is maybe 330 BCE to 300 or so CE. You'll notice in this picture, this is the Empire of Alexander. It goes from Albania, more or less, all the way to India, the Himalayas, Kazakhstan, say. It's enormous. And this would have been the first time that the world was connected in this way. And so since we all take this for granted, I would like just to stop and let you think about how weird that was. For all of this this landscape here to have been connected by roads, protected by armies. They were allowed to keep their own gods, principally. They were allowed to keep their own languages. but they were connected for the first time. So Greek people could go visit Egyptian people, could visit Roman people, could visit the remnants of the Persian Empire, and people actually started, talking to one another for the very first time. And be assured that this was fabulous for the mercantile class, but even better for magicians, I suppose. Francis Legge has a great quotation about this, and he alleges that there has probably been no time in the history of mankind, when all classes were more given up to the thoughts of religion, or when they strained more fervently after high ethical ideas, than in the 6 centuries from 300 BCE to 300 CE. So a thought here, people have been brainwashed by biblical scholars about this time period, thinking that the reason Christianity gained a foothold was that paganism didn't work anymore. Well, so that's not really true. People are starting to write about that nowadays. The Christians at this point had begun to dismantle the classical world and were looking for reasons to be able to do that. Nonetheless, let us say that this type of religious syncretism had to wait for the arrival of Alexander the Great and his amazing empire. Now, all that being said, Christianity was also a product of this strange situation. And recall that Alexander died at age 32 of malaria, and he left the vast empire to 4 generals who, predictably, immediately started fighting over land and resources and tore the empire up. And further, just to drill into everyone's head how enormous Alexander's empire was, here I have shown the distance east to west on a Google map. So if a person were to walk straight from Albania to the Indus River, it would take them 1,200 hours. And it's more or less 6,000 kilometers. So it's really big. And further, from one end to the other, actually it's not flat. And so here is an altitude map inset on the left. Now, needless to say, Alexander didn't walk from one end to the other. He stopped periodically to kick ass. So the fact that Alexander accomplished this by the age of 32 speaks to his acumen as a warrior, and probably also the support he got from his father Philip. Anyway, now you can understand it's basically the whole of the Middle East, plus a little bit on either side. So indeed, what are the Greek magical papyri, or papyri? I suppose we could pronounce that correctly. These are a body of papyri written in Greek, Coptic, and Demotic, and they came to light through the antiques trade from the early 1700s onward. So they have been dated from 100 BCE to about 400 CE. And I'd like to emphasize that they're a modern collection of text. So think of a bunch of piles of pieces of paper, scrolls, manuscripts basically, that have been combined in the modern world. So older ones are combined with newer ones. It's really a kind of a chaotic mess, let's say that. So people don't really know where they're from precisely. They don't really understand in any degree of precision when they were written. People spend a fair amount of time hypothesizing about who wrote them. Hans-Dieter Betz, who is responsible for the version of the Greek magical papyri that most of us are using, he believes that they form a fraction of magical books that must have existed in antiquity, and considers them a form of underground literature subject to book burnings at the times. He discusses the notion of book burnings listed in the Acts of the Apostles. Further, Augustus placed an order to burn magical books that was documented. Basically, if you buy Hans-Dieter Betz's argument, we're lucky to have them at all. More recent researchers, in particular David Frankfurter, who wins my award for the best name in the business, he hypothesizes that the production of the PGM was principally performed by innovative members of the Egyptian priesthood during the 3rd and 4th century decline of the Egyptian temple infrastructure. So basically, working manuals. And I would say, now keep in mind that the literacy rate of folks during this period of time is not very high. And so the fact that they were actually written down places them outside of normal traditional folk magic. That will be important in a little bit. PGM 12 and 13 appeared in Latin in 1885. PGM 5, our favorite guy, was first translated by Goodwin into English in 1853, referenced by Budge in 1899. And now you have a pretty good idea of where Crowley ran into this stuff. Later, in the 20th century, Preissendance, who was a German researcher, and Hans-Dieter Betz got their hands on it and turned it into something we could read in German and English. The present day is full of lots of discussion online. Lots of people are actually performing rituals from the PGM. There is a Blackthorn School class taught by my friend Jack Grail. And soon, and this should make every OTO member's heart swell with pride, Brian Alt, who is a member of Anabasis Camp, is going to publish Interlinear Magic. He is pretty sure it's going to come out in February. And you can get a copy of it if you get a hold of him. Jack's class is acclaimed, well-attended, and fun, by the way. I liked it a whole bunch. And here is an example of a PGM spell. This is a page from Hans-Dieter Betz's handbook, and it's clearly a tested spell for those possessed by demons. It shows a number of characteristics that are really common in these PGM spells. Bullet number 1 points to the fruit pulp of the lotus, the discussion of magical materia. Now, this materia, the range of possible items used in these spells is really amazing. It can comprise animal parts, sometimes entire live animals, plants, spices, and strange inanimate objects. Potsherds are a favorite. There are modern researchers that claim the animal parts refer to herbs and plants. I think I'm disinclined to buy that. And something that's obvious, so sorry for saying it, but these items are all things that would have been commonly available in late classical antiquity. For example, you just go to the market and get them. If they had been written recently, these spells would include cars, microwave ovens, cell phones, and candy bars. A further characteristic here at bullet number 2 is that there are a whole bunch of spells written for clients. You can see here how the arrow leads to NN. That is to insert the name of the client. Then another very distinguishing characteristic is the presence of the barbarous names, voces magicae, let's say, including a bunch of cool palindromic ones. These words, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, are largely nonsensical. They may contain hints of god names, of other spell names. Some of them are just, they feel just like nonsense. Most of them are really hard to say, strangely. So we'll talk about those in a bit. The spells in general are syncretic with all sorts of different gods represented. I can think of Jewish, Egyptian, Greek, Assyrian, Hebrew, yeah, Jewish. There's all sorts of crazy stuff that's represented here. That leads back to my assertion that none of this stuff would have been possible without Alexander the Great. It really, these documents really needed to have all of that, all of the world, the known world connected at that time. Spells in the PGM range from exorcisms all the way to hymns to many deities. The hymns are lovely. I would encourage everyone to go look at those. And then if you want to win at horse races, they got you covered. And now to focus on our particular spell, which is known by some people as the stele of Jehu, the hieroglyphist, in his letter. You can see here is Goodwin's text, an address to the god written upon the letter. And it's clearly starting out as an exorcism. So some of this is going to sound really familiar. I call thee the headless one that didst create earth and heaven, that didst create night and day. And then at the bottom, listen to me, hear me, and drive away the spirit. Clearly an exorcism. Now, the ritual as a whole has a fair emphasis on Jewish magic and theology. And there is kind of working hypothesis that Jehu might mean Yod-He Vav-He, possibly. There are pieces of it that sound very Genesis-like. There is a reference to Moses, I am Moses thy prophet, to whom thou didst commit thy mysteries, the ceremonies of Israel. And then there are these two references to Asura Nofris. So who is Asura Nofris? People are pretty sure that this means beautiful Osiris. And just as the orator in the Stele of Jehu ultimately identifies with the supreme progenitor solar deity, so do souls who successfully traverse the underworld become Ra in the Egyptian afterlife and God in late classical theurgy. But one of the things that I really want to bring your attention to is that there is this interesting syntax change mid-ritual to the operator talking to God to the operator being God. Even without plugging our way through the rest of this ritual, we have some big questions about the Headless Rite. So I think we should probably dig through these shortly before we move on to the 19th and 20th century here. So who is the Headless One, Akevelos? Some folks think that this might represent the Egyptian god Bes. The reason for that is that the description of Bes sort of meets with the illustrations, the like of which we saw earlier. Now, Bes is a well-known god who is present in ancient Egypt, and he is associated with mirth, merriment, music, and childbirth. Maybe. So the Headless One could also be Osiris. It would make sense based on what we know of the Osiris story. Another possible thought is that the removal of the head is the removal of the personal. As we are well aware of these days, faces were preserved in mummification. Faces, elaborate and detailed faces are drawn on sarcophagi. And the removal of the head actually makes a body or a god completely impersonal. Further, what is meant by side and the feet? There are a couple of things that people are playing with there. One of the more whimsical notion is that Egyptians did wear pretty fancy slippers. But I will be silly and say Uraeus toes. Maybe a more serious explanation for the side and the feet comment is that the heads of executed criminals were placed at the feet to prevent them from putting their heads back on, basically, and running around. So just some thoughts there. It's clearly a new and improved exorcism. So it's an exorcism plus some other stuff. So as we said before, Asura Nofris is beautiful Osiris. Yabos and Yapos are Samaritan names for Yahweh. And then there's the heart encircled with a serpent part. So with respect to the heart and the aeon, Phanes, according to the ancient Greek historian Diodorus, was identified with Osiris among the Orphics, and the neo-Platonic apologist Proclus identified Phanes with Dionysus, who was generally regarded in the ancient world as the Greek equivalent of Osiris. So back to Osiris. And then there's this weird syntax change, which is the primary reason for my interest. And now to dig into this issue of the barbarous names. We know that they weren't transliterated by Goodwin, but he did present the Greek. And this is probably where Crowley got his hands on them first. Interestingly, Florence Farr talks about them in her book on Egyptian magic, and she associates them with Jesus. Budge didn't publish them either, but he talks about the clearer god names. A whole lot later, Rigardi quips, what they mean is anyone's guess, but he recognizes some god names. And further, here's a quote from Rigardi. This discussion of the macabre, barbarous magical words often reminds me of glossolalia, for in practice one may occasionally derive as much pleasure from vibrating and using these barbarous names as do apparently those in revival meetings who every so often speak in tongues. Glossolalia may, and even does, degenerate into mere gibberish, but there are some occasions when it may serve as a stepping stone to God. Later, and I think this happens in ceremonial magic, he refers to them as psychedelic agents. Stephen Skinner, not to be left out, separated them into a couple different types: names of gods, angels and demons of Hebrew origin, strings of vowels, and as we mentioned before, these can represent musical notes, gods and goddesses, or planetary indications. Then there are a whole bunch of rites that have onomatopoetic words in them, barks and pops and hisses, as we say here, and then the palindromic barbarous names are astonishing. They do seem to be extensions of Greek and Egyptian gods. Then there are a whole raft of letters arranged in geometric shapes and words from other languages. Now, just for fun, the Chaldean oracles, when addressing the barbarous names, state not to change as much as a letter. We know about that. And so once you get into the middle of the Headless Rite, then you encounter this weird syntax change. It's underlined in red. He is the Lord of the gods. He is the Lord of the inhabited world. And then there are some barbarous names. You call the Lord King, Master, Helper, and then all of a sudden, the operator is the headless daimon with sight in my feet. So we've gone from talking to God to being God. This notion of the magical operator actually approaching or becoming deity sounds an awful lot like theurgy. Theurgy is a Greek word that means God work. This word was first apparently used in the Chaldean oracles, which are dated to the 2nd century CE. So it's a late notion compared with Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, correct? We know, because we've all, or many of us have taken philosophy in college, that philosophy in general has come forward to us stripped of religion. That is, it's a logical way of thinking. But historically speaking, philosophy was replete with religious ideas. And I would say that the theurgy that we're talking about here, Jamblican and the theurgy of Proclus, for example, haven't been studied a whole lot because most scholars were biblical ones. And they kind of saw this ritualistic reaching toward God as a fallen version of Hellenism. Nonetheless, we have a couple of really good researchers that I can recommend you to. Now, embedded in theurgy is this notion of tuning a container for the occupation of a deity. I'm bringing that up principally because Aleister Crowley was interested in doing this with respect to knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And telestike is the word for this tuning process, say. So one can also feel the influence of the mystery cults in this creation of a receptacle. as well as other ways in theurgy, I should mention. But there are a whole lot of related concepts between the mystery cults and theurgy, including the animation of statues and to some degree mummification. The theurgic ascent can be seen to be the opposite of creation. Now, the third bullet here, death before death trademark, feeds right back to mystery cults where people are basically practicing dying before they have to do it so that they're not unnerved by the process. It takes away the fear, I suppose. And of course, other things happen in mystery cults, but we're going to focus on that just for a minute. And the reason that we're focusing on that is that it is a theurgical premise that men must become nothing before they are made into gods. And so most of what we know about mystery cults, which isn't much because, of course, they're mystery cults, involve symbolic murder or death. And Proclus has this really cagey description of the thing. He says, Persephone has been so named because she separates the souls perfectly from their bodies by turning them back to what is above. And this is the most fortunate sort of murder and death for those worthy of it. So that's a quotation from Crowley. So stepping back to the Headless Rite, this sounds like theurgy, honestly. The practitioner uses exorcism in the first part to create that container that we talked about, telestiki, and then the remainder of the rite is the assumption of the god. So as a practitioner, we should all be thinking, well, what if the Headless Rite is simple preparation for more complex or sophisticated magic? Because the gods, of course, are capable of magic, more capable than people. And in the picture here, we have a crater that shows the demiurge from the theurgical cosmic view, mixing the world and individual souls. Okay, so now we're going to fast forward 1600 or 1700 years to Aleister Crowley, who appears here in France in 1903 or 1904, looking for all the world like an ordinary fellow. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are entering the Thelemic portion of our discussion. We know for a fact that the Golden Dawn used all or part of the Headless Rite at various times, including a group ritual that I think a person can get their hands on. First, it was published in 1903 or 1904. People think that it was composed by Alan Bennett. HB is alleged to have said that because textual similarities to the evocation of Taft Thartharath. Certainly, Alan Bennett introduced Crowley to it. In the preliminary invocation of the Goetia, the original barbarous names, some of which we saw earlier, were retained. And there have been two really fruitful uses of the "Come Thou Forth" refrain. We all know about the invocation of Horus and the thrill of thee I invoke. And then we also know the story of Crowley and Rose in the King's Chamber, where he invoked the sylphs for Rose. And then we all know that something sort of unintended happened after that with the reception of the Book of the Law in April of 1904. Later in the 20s, Crowley reworked this whole thing into what we know today as Liber Samekh. Okay, now that we're up to date on where Crowley received his inspiration and primary documents, now let's talk about the purpose of the Bornless Rite and Liber Samekh. Liber Samekh's full name is Theurgia Goetia Summa Congressus cum Daimone Subfigura DCCC 800. It's a Class D document for the grade of Adeptus Minor and is described as being the ritual employed by the beast 666 for the attainment of knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel during the semester of his performance of the operation of the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage. So Class D documents are official rituals and instructions. It's clear that that's what this is. and it was written at the Abbey of Thelema in service to Frater Progradior, that is William Bennett, and Crowley wrote it as a replacement for the Abramelin Rite. And just for fun, here are some pictures of my copy of the Goetia. On the right-hand side, you can see the changes that Crowley made to the text with the I invoke, the beautiful rhythm of the thing. Little and Mathers translated this, of course. There's an introduction by Aleister Crowley that includes a curse on Mathers. And if you haven't paid any attention to that part, go look right away. And here is the headless versus the bornless. We're going to actually look at them side by side. So on the left, I summon you, headless one. And then on the right, this amazing rhythm that could have been Bennett. Thee I invoke, the bornless one. Thee that didst create the earth and the heavens. Thee that didst create the night and the day. It's amazingly wonderful, even though it says a lot of the same things as the headless ritual. And here we have the headless compared with the bornless again. Arba Theo, Ar Theo. I should remind you that the F is to represent the Hebrew vowel and the digamma. So in every case, that actually sounds like O. So Ribet, Thel Berseth, Thel Berset. Does sound like Typhon, right? Satan. Ara, Albelatha. So here's some changes. He's played around with this a little bit, and he's attributed the meanings of the barbarous names. We'll talk a bit more about how he generated the meanings in a minute. All right, and here's Crowley's workup of the barbarous names, focused entirely towards KNCHGA. Remember that in the Headless Rite, we're talking Lord, King, Master, Helper, Save the Soul, Iao Pir, Iao Pir, Iaot, Iao, Ioo, Abrasax, Sabriam, Oo, Ee, Ei, Oo, Ee, Adonai, immediately, good messenger of God. So here we have a bunch of things that look a little bit like that. Eo pur, pur, Eoth. They also close. Eo, Ao, Eo o u, Abrasax, Sabriam, and then the I, Satan, my lord, the lust of the goat. And now we're in section B. Recall that we're traveling astrally around the circle of Widdershins, and we move 3 times, each 3/4 of a rotation, to address the elemental quarters. The operator visualizes colors and solar phallic animals, including a hippopotamus. So further, here we're playing more with the barbarous names. We have Uu, Adonai, Ede, Edu, and Angelos ton theon, Anlala, Lai, Gaia, Epe, Dai, Thanathoron. And these are very similar to the ones that are straight from the Headless ritual. And then what I'm terming the most universally useful section, hear me and make all spirits subject unto me, so that every spirit of the firmament and of the ether, upon the earth and under the earth, on dry land and in the water, of whirling air and of rushing fire, and every spell and scourge of God may be obedient unto me. And here the attainment script, I'm going to call it, of the Headless Rite and the Samekh version of it are compared. And you can see that they say similar things. But over here on the right, I would just call this an incredibly brilliant, rhythmic, strong, potent, powerful ritual. I am he, the bornless spirit, having sight in the feet, strong in the immortal fire. I am he, the truth. I am he who hates that evil should be wrought in the world. Just incredible stuff. I think this shows the power of Crowley's influence, the amazing work that Bennett did. It just it humbles one. And I wanted to say also, I would be remiss if I didn't confess to have used the script in Liber Samekh with both he and she. To me, they feel different because in my head, he and she, I suppose, are different. I would encourage everyone to play around with that, particularly the female members of the audience. We're headed into the final corner now, and I want to issue one beef I have with the headless to bornless conversion. It shouldn't actually be called bornless according to me because it's not really in Hebrew. And of course, this happened because in Hebrew, head is resh, and resh is beginning, and beginning is birth, and then if there's no head, there's no birth. But you know, the cat shows how I feel about that exactly. So to wrap things up, I think it's unlikely that Crowley understood, you know, all this theurgy stuff the way scholars do today. But it's amazing, and it's wonderful for us that he recognized the power in the switch of that syntax, because you noticed he kept that. And he recognized as a ritualist the purpose and the amazing utility of the Headless Rite. And of course, Liber Samekh is incredibly useful and powerful. And if, you know, if there's any one person out there who hasn't performed it yet, shame on you. You know, get thee to a Samekhery. But also try the original. It's good to have your feet in the historical foundations of all of this. And you know, to wrap it up totally with a bow, these rites are an example of how both now and in the late classical world, gods did magic and men could be gods. And of course, there is no God but man. Love is the law. Love under will. Thanks a million, everyone.
That was absolutely fabulous. Wow. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So let's before we play this to Scott, we are close to 8 o'clock. So instead of playing this YouTube movie, let me explain to the audience what it is and let them go do it. And maybe they'll listen to the whole thing. So what you see on Scott's screen is or you did. He pressed the button.
Put it back up.
No, that's good. So everybody should go to YouTube and look up Israel Regardie Bornless ritual. So he recites the whole thing in Israel Regardie style, and it's really something perfect. So since we're close to 8 o'clock, why don't I assign you some homework, all you lovely people out there? Go watch this, and you know, enjoy it. Then that'll give me a couple of minutes to ask questions or answer questions if anybody has any.
All right. Well, yeah, let's open it up for Q&A if anybody has any questions they would like to address. That was absolutely fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for doing that. But that's no surprise because you're awesome.
Well, thank you.
Harper, this is not so much a question as just sort of a compliment, and clearly the egregore is going somewhere, because I've spent the last 3 months in various classes ranting about how the Hellenistic era and the aftermath of Alexander essentially created all of the Hermetic mysteries in one form or another. My favorite way of describing Kabbalah is a head-on collision between Neoplatonism and Merkaba. So, it's really fun seeing that your head is going in a similar groove. So thank you.
Shocking, I know.
I know. Who'd have thunk it?
No, thank you.
I wonder if anyone else has picked up on the barbarous name Balata being very similar to the Enochian word for justice.
Oh, I haven't heard anyone bring that up. That's a good point.
That's interesting.
Very true.
Yeah, I wonder whether or not the PGM might have been in Dee's libraries. I don't know.
The timing is a little bit wrong. At least as far as I understand it, the first portions of what we recognize as the PGM showed up in antique markets in the 1700s. So that would have put it just a little bit too late for John Dee to get his fingers on it. Although that would have been great, wouldn't it? Imagine what he would have done. Oh my God.
I like it better this way, because then you get to wonder about how a word gets into two different texts where there's no obvious link.
Some of these words, they have a grip on our imagination clearly, and for people to remember and use words, it doesn't require that they be written down. So it's miraculous, but perhaps we shouldn't see that as an impossibility.
Now, words take very twisty paths through history at times, and it's quite possible for a word to be preserved into two different traditions and then recombine later, often in mutant forms, where it's not clear that they're both coming from the same root originally.
Yeah.
Right, and if you want to prove that to yourself, you should go do a Google search on confusing product names. So products that make perfect, the names of which make perfect sense in English are often very confusing to people in foreign countries. The Chevrolet, known as the Nova, didn't sell very well in South America because it means doesn't go, for example. But the words are present in both vocabularies.
Mm-hmm.
Harper, I have a question about you suggesting doing the original. Are you talking about in the actual original Greek, or do you mean the translation in Betz? Or something different?
Oh, what a delightful question. So I myself am brave enough to risk the anger of the gods by mangling the Greek. I haven't been struck by lightning yet. I will confess to have done the Betz version a whole lot more often. But all of this stuff is, we should see all of this as experimentation and twiddle all the knobs.
Because what I tend to do is sort of a weird hybrid of Betz, the actual translator, is David Yawn. On's work mixed with the preliminary invocation. And then a healthy amount of I don't want to translate specific words because of akephalos is a pun, and I feel like you kind of lose that if you translate it into English.
Right on. That's a completely valid approach from my perspective. But I guess I'm...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was saying that unfortunately I don't speak Greek, so I can only guess if I'm doing it right.
Well, this would be a good reason to get your hands on Brian's book. The interlinear version that he's going to put out in February will enable all of those decisions to be readily made by either a researcher or more to my evil purposes, the practitioner.
And also, even if you don't understand Greek, if you're or in any other language that you might be doing a ritual in, at least you're not burdening yourself with the limitations of a particular English translation. So, for example, the Greek word pneuma, which comes up in the Mass, would probably be most directly translated into English as spirit if we said that same sentence in English. But pneuma has so many other resonances on it that much would be lost. So it's almost better to start with a word you don't understand at all and then learn its resonances in that language rather than pinning yourself down to a partial understanding in your own language.
Yeah.
Beautifully said, Kathy.
Thank you.
Anything else? This has been a real pleasure for me. Thanks to everyone who's out there. Look me up on Facebook if you decide to have questions later, or you want to tell me I got things wrong. That's it. I always like to hear hear when I've done well, when I've mangled things a little bit.
I thought it was a wonderful presentation, and I'm very honored to have been present. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It was wonderful.
Yes, you did.
Thanks
You
so
did
much.
brilliantly well. Whoa. Usually I don't do that unless I'm using the voice.
Right?
NHS are confirmed.
Well, I'm going to go have dinner with Leanne, but take care, everybody.
right.
And Harper, again, thanks so much.
Best to all.
Thank you.
93.
Hey,
93.
93.
93.
Well, damn. Real quick, public events calendar on the Education Committee website. Check it out if you're ever looking for something now that half the people have left. But it's
I
all
always
good.
do
You'll
that
find
with
it one way or
professional
the other.
meetings.
Yeah, it's like, okay, dipped.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll get this, we'll get it trimmed up and cleaned up and hosted up on the Grand Lodge's YouTube. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Harper. That was awesome. I think it will probably be very motivational for people to get up off their ass and get up in that Greek. Let's do it.
I hope so.
All right. Well,
All right.
thank you again, and I'll talk to you again soon. And thank
Oh,
you
I'm
for
sure
everybody
we
who
will.
came out. And yeah, all right. Love is the law. Love under will. Good night.
Good night.